This podcast is brought to you by Mapper Forward's new Patreon community, the Global Coffee Think Tank. Check the show notes or head to patreon.com/mapperforward to find out how you can become a member today. Welcome back to the Daily Coffee Pro by Mapper Forward, friends. I am joined by the very entertaining and deeply insightful Brian Gaffney. Brian, welcome back to the podcast. We are talking about specialty coffee from the perspective of the specialty coffee consumer. And we have spoken about what specialty coffee is from your perspective, and we've talked about how you choose coffees. And today we're asking, does specialty coffee have a branding problem? And listeners of this podcast are probably sick of me exploring branding, the branding of coffee. But if you are listening to this podcast for the first time, why I harp on this issue of branding in coffee is because I personally believe that coffee in general, the word coffee has a branding problem. Instant coffee is called coffee. Roasted coffee is called coffee. Espresso is called coffee. Green coffee is called coffee. And coffee from a widespread of pricing is all called coffee. And so today, Brian, we're going to explore, does specialty coffee have a branding problem? What are your thoughts on that?
I have a lot of them. And full disclosure, I spent a year of my life studying branding. So part of when I have a master's degree in branding from the School of Visual Arts here in the US, who are actually the first graduate program in branding in the United States.
Wow.
And while there, that was actually part of my own journey in specialty. So as I was learning about branding, for me, I was always looking at specialty coffee. And I will tell you, Lee, I think when it comes to branding, that is one of the greatest challenges, if not failures, for the majority of the specialty coffee industry.
Yeah. And this is why I've been encouraging my clients to separate themselves out from specialty by starting to term or position their branding to be about experience coffees rather than specialty coffees. Right. Because I feel that there's a web that specialty coffee has got itself into because it missed the opportunity to define what specialty coffee meant. In the beginning of when the term was first coined and as it's evolved, we haven't had the Specialty Coffee Association really keep up with helping set a standard of what specialty coffee means, other than the technical perspective of green coffee is graded at a specialty from 80 and above.
Right.
Why do you feel that we have this problem, this branding problem of specialty coffee? Where do you think it comes from?
I think that part of the origin of the issue is that it has grown organically out of the mass of what was commercial coffee, right? At one point, all coffee was the same. And then as we started to get to separating by quality, which was then really driven based on scores, which is primarily used to inform purchasing. But the idea of, from the consumer's perspective, we need to define this so that for the person who's stepping into the cafe or buying online, they have a sense of what that is. So in many ways, the emergence, as I understand it, of specialty was really a business to business concept and an issue. It really wasn't a business to consumer perspective. So the idea of thinking about specialty coffee from the consumer's perspective, I think, is something that the industry is really just now beginning to entertain. That if specialty coffee is 80 points or better, right, zero category 1 defects, this amount of category 2 defects, et cetera, most consumers don't care anything about that. I've been buying specialty coffee for over 15 years, Lee. I cannot tell you the last time I asked about the point score of a coffee.
Right.
It just doesn't matter to me anymore. It's not that it's not important, but it doesn't matter to me as a consumer because I'm buying based upon different decision drivers, triggers, et cetera. And so I think so the idea of thinking about it, and here for me is the other challenge. So instead of the industry really asking consumers, why do you buy? How do you buy? What do you buy? Now you want to tell me what I should buy. So instead of then helping to figure out from my perspective, right? So what is it about, Brian? What do you like? How do you? It's no, let me tell you what you should like, and then let me tell you what you should pay for. Well, at that point, if you're going to patronize me to death, if you're going to admonish me for not being smart enough to, well, then now I'm turned off. And so for me, really, going back to the original question, I think that ultimately there's a branding problem because branding is primarily and in this context, a business to consumer view. And the industry has not yet seriously undertaken a conversation with consumers to understand what is it that we want and or need, and what is the journey that we go on to go from buying that first cup of coffee and what that looks like 3, 4, 10 years later.
You mentioned something really pivotal there, which is in essence that branding is about storytelling. Mm-hmm. And the storytelling of the coffee experience has been primarily led or hijacked by the big companies. You know, it's Starbucks, excuse me, Starbucks, Dunkin' Donuts, Nescafe, Nestle have really sucked the air out of the room or predominated the conversation around branding for coffee. Mm-hmm. And yet the specialty industry as a whole hasn't found a way to come together and really push a definition or I guess a storyline of what specialty coffee really is. They're looking for guidance. And this is why I have asked Yanis, the CEO of SCA, to come on the podcast. And he said he was coming on the podcast. And I'm going to hold him to that because we really need to have an understanding of what the fuck the SCA is doing if they are not helping with this. Because the reason the bigger companies are leading in this is because we're not doing anything to balance it out.
There's an analogy that I've used before when talking about the specialty coffee industry. And admittedly, this comes from, as I mentioned, a couple of episodes ago, I worked in the music industry mm-hmm. before coming to consulting. And so when I think about the specialty coffee industry, I think it shares a lot of things in common with the recorded music industry. And really, so at the core of this thing, we're going to get to who's the hero of the story. In the recorded music industry, you have the artist. And I think in many ways, the artist and the coffee producer have a lot in common. I think your importers and exporters almost function as like your talent agents and your management companies. I think your roasters often function as the recording labels, right? And then I think that the baristas often function as the DJs. And so if you look at a lot of the interactions between these roles, between the recorded music industry and the coffee, and the specialty coffee industry in particular, we saw the recorded music industry blow up. Right. And it's really how we ended up with iTunes completely shifting the dynamic in many instances. It was because consumers were tired of spending $18, $19 US for a CD that only had 2 or 3 songs on it, and knowing that artists were being paid pennies on the dollar. Now we look specialty coffee, similar. Sometimes you have producers that are making less than pennies on the dollar, right? But they really do sit at the center of mm-hmm. This entire industry. And so when we think about the idea of branding, who are we centering? Whose narrative are we telling? And where is there the opportunity for that story to become compelling enough for end consumers to care? Mm-hmm. Right? And so this is where I think there's a lot of opportunity to, and I have to admit, I think one of the teams who does it really, really well is there's Onyx Coffee out of Arkansas, and then there's Standout Coffee out of Stockholm in Sweden, and both of whom I've been buying for years. Full disclosure, mm-hmm. But again, I buy all coffee. Nobody sends me free coffee. Don't take free coffee. But for me, they act as it really is about the partnership. If you look at it, and I again, full disclosure, wrote about this on Daily Coffee News. If you look at Onyx is almost set up in their box redesign, the producer sits almost like it's top billing if you were going to a concert, right? And so the way you look at the marquee at that particular venue, that's the way that producer gets highlighted. And so what you start to see is that relationship. And so if as I watch Onyx's storytelling, as I look at the stories on the website, I'm hearing how often they've been buying from that producer. I'm hearing, right, and showing what the prices paid are. Now, we can have a conversation about whether or not the price they're paying is what we think is fair or isn't. But one of the things I most like is they put it out there so that now we can start to have that conversation. I love the way that Standout Coffee does their boxes. And I've had this conversation with Alexander from Standout, but the way the box is set up, it really almost looks like they're featuring the coffee on a stage where it's their box and they reveal the producer's coffees. If we start to really rethink not just storytelling, but whose story we're telling and who we're censoring in that story, I think that the dynamic for customers to care will be transformed. But that means that a lot of people who are used to being the hero are going to have to become the sidekick or potentially the narrator. And I think that's going to be devastating for a lot of people to consider.
Boy, I love that analogy of the music industry, because to take the analogy further, independent artists suffer a lot in the music industry, and we still haven't fixed that problem. We thought when there was that shift from the old music industry model to the new music industry model, we thought that there was going to be a way that the power differential was going to shift to the independent artist, because, you know, artists could release their music directly to the public. I remember being at South by Southwest and listening to the guys from Napster talk about why this was going to be a great thing for the music industry at the time. And now what we've seen as that model has evolved, it didn't solve the problem. In fact, it brought all the artists further down. They now can only really make money with the introduction of 360-degree deals. They're only really making money off ancillary brands. Even the tour money, Jay-Z will tell you, you know, I don't make money off music anymore. Well, fuck, if Jay-Z's not making money off music anymore, who the fuck's going to make money off music? Now we've got a similar dynamic in coffee, where you've got the smallholder producers who are like the independent artists, getting hammered even more with what's going on with the US dollar, with what's going on with all of this economic shifting, with the increase in inputs that are coming because of geopolitical issues, et cetera, et cetera. We thought that by making, with the introduction of social media, of putting the producers front and center, or with this idea of relationship buying between the cafes and producers, we were going to elevate the experience of producers. In fact, what we ended up seeing was rockstar brands and rockstar producers joined forces to become the super labels. And now what you've got is that being amplified with World Barista competitions, which is the Napster of the whole thing. And I don't see a way out of that web in the short term. And I think you are absolutely right. If we don't invest the energy and the effort to fix this problem, I think we're in trouble. But this is a solvable problem.
Yes.
That's what's so exciting about it. It's a solvable problem. If we can find the right resources and the right leadership to actually invest in solving this problem. And I had this conversation with the fabulous Alejandro Cadena on this podcast. And I know you have a great relationship with Alejandro, and I'm sure we're going to talk about that in the coming episodes. But we need to find a body that takes the leadership on helping us as an industry have a unified message around what specialty coffee is, because the alternative is what we're doing with our clients at Map It Forward is, this is going to be too hard. We can't lead this movement. We're going to come up with something else, and that is experience coffee.
Mm-hmm.
Because we can't be a part of that mess anymore, the specialty coffee mess. The specialty coffee mess is something that, you know, is just too hard to do. And we had this event here in Sydney last year called the Sydney Coffee Town Hall, where the general consensus was from everybody, we've got to stop using the term specialty coffee.
Okay.
Because specialty coffee doesn't mean anything to anybody anymore.
Mm-hmm.
If Starbucks is using the word specialty coffee and we're using the word specialty coffee, what is specialty coffee? So you're 100% right when you say what you say about it's lost. The identity of the brand is, I don't know if it's lost or if it hasn't actually adequately been defined yet.
And Lee, I lean into the latter. Even as at SCA this year, you know, and the SCA talked about this new definition of specialty coffee, and you could feel in the room, and you could feel it when they first released the white paper. That new definition was released to mixed opinion and mixed reviews. And I think it's because the industry is still trying to identify and articulate what it is. And I appreciated the introduction of extrinsic values and intrinsic values. However, I think I still look at those as that's still the conversation you're having as you have someone selling coffee, green coffee, to someone buying coffee. I still don't think that that's the right conversation when you're talking to someone who's on the other side of the counter. Because, Lee, as you and I both know, what it comes down to is if I, as the consumer, am not willing to pay for it, doesn't matter any of the other conversations that happen across the value chain.
100%.
If you can't convince me, right? And I also agree that this is a solvable problem. But you have to have some people, to your point, to sign up and say, I'm willing to lean in to do the hard work, right? Like, because in order to fix it, it's going to be disrupted. And again, we look at the history of business across any sector, and that's what we see. Transformation comes from disruption. You don't incrementally get to an improved industry. You have a shifting of the balance of powers. You typically have a shifting in the leaders within those industries. You typically have a shifting of the power dynamics. And so the industry is going to have to, no, actually, disruption typically doesn't come with permission, right? And so really, I think what will continue to happen is if, for example, you have rock star roasters and you have rock star producers, and again, you look at that industry model, if there's enough money to be made there, that then you start looking at how can we develop other producers to become rock stars, right? Then how do we start carving out that investment? But that also goes back to something we talked about earlier. It's the maturity of the industry. Now we're really starting to talk about business principles, Lee, that I think by and large are relatively new to specialty. And that's, again, not casting aspersion to the leaders of the industry right now, but where do you get that education that helps you understand? How do you get to the point of understanding, right, all of the my operating model, where the costs are, what can I shift? What do people care about? Like, these are the kinds of things people need to know so that they think about, how do I shift my business? What can I afford to shift? It's not just pay my baristas less and pay less for coffee, right? It is what other kinds of things can I do to transform my business so that consumers are willing to pay more, so that I can afford to pay more for coffee, so that I can afford to properly train and compensate my baristas for the work that they're doing. That's where I think the industry has to mature and grow to transform.
And with that, folks, we couldn't have been set up for the next episode any better than that, because in the next episode, we're going to be talking about what specialty coffee gets right and wrong. And you set it up beautifully. So let's do it. Peace, love, and peanut butter. Have an amazing rest of your day. Thanks, friends. If you enjoyed this video, here's what you should check out next. Consider supporting Map It Forward on Patreon, and be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell before you leave.